On our side, General Hope's division formed the left of the line, resting their left flank on the slimy banks of the Mero, extending his right so as to join Baird's division towards the centre of our line. From this, Baird prolonged his division to the right, in front of the enemy's left, and was outflanked by the great battery, which in an oblique direction was situated in his front. Our left wing and the right of the enemy were much further asunder than the contending wings on the other flank. This materially weakened our position, but it could not be avoided, owing to the conformation of the slopes upon which alone we could be drawn up. These slopes gradually retired from our right to our left, and consequently the great French battery raked the whole of our line. General Fraser's division were drawn up close to Corunna to watch the coast road and to be in readiness to proceed to any part where needed most. On the morning of the 16th, all the encumbrances of the army which had not been embarked the previous night were put on board, and then everything prepared for a battle or retreat. It was intended to embark the army that night, as soon as darkness should screen their retirement. The reserve, whose post was not so open to the observation of the enemy, were to go on board in the afternoon. We were told that in consequence of general good conduct during the retreat, and having covered the army at Corunna for 2 whole days, we should be the first division to embark, and thus have time to make ourselves comfortable. All our baggage and such sea stock as we could procure was shipped, and after the men had dined, we marched towards the transports. Our minds were now occupied by thoughts of home. But we had not proceeded above 100 yards when we heard the firing of guns. The division halted to a man, as if by word of command. Each looked with anxious inquiry. But we were not kept long in suspense. An aide-de-camp came galloping at full speed to arrest our progress, telling us that an extraordinary movement was taking place throughout the enemy's line. The 3 guns fired were a signal to give notice. We instantly countermarched and passed through the village of Los Aires, where but 20 minutes before we had bidden adieu to Spain and considered ourselves on the way to England. But many there were who in a few hours were prevented from ever beholding their native shore. They paid the last tribute to their country, surrendering their lives in maintaining the sacred cause of liberty and national independence. Immediately on passing through this village we halted. The enemy's dark columns were seen advancing from 3 different points, and with rapid pace literally coming down upon us, cheered by their guns, which sent their shot over their heads but plunged into our line, which, at the same time, was raked from right to left by their great battery. During these primary operations, we became the reserve in reality, but continued so only until the commander of the forces should ascertain to a certainty where the enemy intended making their fiercest attack. And as to the point where this was to take place, Sir John Moore was not mistaken. He knew that he was opposed to the ablest marshal of France, and he therefore prepared to resist the attack at that point where he himself would have made it had the order of battle been reversed. Firm in his opinion, he shortly after our arrival at Los Aires ordered the 95th Regiment to be detached from the reserve. Their duty was to keep the heavy dragoons of Lorge and Franceschi's light cavalry in play. Between the rifles and the right of Baird's division, the 52nd formed a loose chain across the valley. He then rode off, leaving orders with General Paget that at the opportune moment he was to move into the valley, turn the French left, and capture their heavy battery, sending at the same time orders to General Fraser to support the reserve. In the meantime, the battle kindled along the whole line. Laborde's division on their right pressed hard upon Hope and took possession of Palavia Abaxo. This was retaken and maintained by Colonel Nichols, who gallantly charged the enemy through the village at the head of a part of the 14th Regiment. On our right, 2 heavy columns descended against Baird's division. One passed through Elvina, a village about midway between the 2 lines. This place was held by our piquets, who were driven back in confusion, but was subsequently retaken. This column made direct for Baird's right, obliging the 4th Regiment to retire their right wing, and then advanced into the valley. The other column attacked the whole front of Baird's division. On Sir John Moores seeing the advance of the column through the valley, he cast a glance to the rear, and perceiving that Paget had commenced his movement, he felt confident that all would go well in that quarter. He then rode up to the right of Baird's line, and told Colonel Wench of the 4th Regiment that his throwing back the right of his regiment was just what he wished. He then moved off towards the village of Elvina, where, after remaining for some time directing the active operations, he fell mortally wounded. But this, when known, served rather to increase than damp the ardour of the men, now more than ever excited to vengeance. Before this melancholy event, the enemy's column, who passed by Baird's right, flushed with the idea of having turned the right of the British army, since the 4th Regiment had retired their right wing, moved sternly forward, certain, as they thought, to come in rear of our troops. But as they advanced, they met the reserve coming on, with aspect stern and determined as their own. They now discovered the true right of the British army. The advanced troops of Soult's army during the march now formed his left. We recognized each other, and the warning at El Burgo was recollected. 1,000 passions boiled in every breast. Our opponents, madly jealous at having their military fame tarnished by the many defeats which they sustained during the march, determined to regain those laurels to them forever lost. We, on the other hand, of the reserve, had many causes to rouse our hatred and revenge. We painfully recollected the wanton carnage committed on the defenceless stragglers of all ages and sexes at Bembibre, and the many bitter cold nights we passed in the mountains of Galicia, when frost and snow alone formed the couches on which we tried to snatch a few hours of repose. The haughty and taunting insults, too, of our Gasconading pursuers were fresh in our memory. One sentiment alone was opposed to our anger. The time was come when it gave us pleasure to think of our past misfortunes, for they who caused them resolutely stood before us, foaming with impatience to wipe away the stain of former defeats. They were no longer inclined to keep aloof. Thus urged forward by mutual hate, wrought up to the highest pitch by 12 days' previous fighting, and knowing the approaching conflict to be our last farewell, we joined in fight, with all the fervour hate bestows, upon the last embrace of foes. Our foes stood firm, but the time occupied in firing was but short. We soon came to the charge, and shortly the opposing column was dissipated. Their cavalry now thought it prudent to retire to and behind their great battery. The 95th, freed from their presence, joined us, and the 52nd, who had slowly retired as the enemy's column first advanced through the valley, also united with their division. And now the reserve were again all united. We now pushed on all together and turned the French left, and were preparing to charge and carry the great French battery. Had Fraser's fresh division, who had not fired a shot, come up now and joined the reserve according to the commander of the force's orders, the whole British line could have made an advance echelon movement to the left, and Soult's army had been lost. Their cavalry had retreated behind their great battery, when they became useless from the rocky nature of the ground. The battery itself was all but in our possession, and only required the short time necessary to march into it. Elvina, on our right, the great point of contention throughout the day, was in our possession, as was the village of Palavia Abaxo on our left. Our whole line had considerably advanced, and the enemy, falling back in confusion, fired more slackly, not so much owing to the casualties they sustained, as to the scarcity and damaged state of their ammunition. Their muskets were bent and battered, while our fire was strong and rapid, our ammunition fresh and abundant, our muskets new, and the nerves which spanned them tense. The only retreat the enemy had was over the patched-up bridge of El Burgo, and this, after the 14th Regiment had taken Pavia Abaxo, was nearly, if not quite, as close to our left as to the French right. The Mero in full tide ran deep, broad and rapid in their rear, and if Napoleon the Great himself had been there, his escape would have been impossible. But the excited troops were drawn away from decisive and continued victory. As darkness approached, our piquets, as usual, lit large fires, and the British army retired to Corunna and embarked that night without the slightest confusion, so completely had everything been previously arranged. On the morning of the 17th, the piquets being withdrawn, the wounded were collected, and with the exception of very few put on board, covered by a brigade still left on shore for that purpose. About noon on this day, Soult managed to bring up some guns to the village of S. Lucia, which played upon the shipping in the harbour, some of which were struck. This causing some disorder amongst the transports, several masters cut their cables, and 4 vessels ran ashore. But the soldiers and crews being immediately rescued by the men of war's boats, and their vessels burned, the fleet got out of harbour. The Spaniards nobly redeemed their pledge to keep the enemy at bay and cover the embarkation to the very last. The few wounded who still remained ashore, together with the rearguard, were put on board early on the morning of the 18th without the loss of a single individual, and the whole sailed for England. Without the remotest intention of depreciating the merits of his gallant successor, Sir John Hope, whose valour and military talents are renowned through the army, there is but little doubt that if Sir John Moore had not fallen the battle, though glorious to his successor and to the British army, would have terminated more decisively. Sir John Moore felt the keenest in the whole army. He, like the lion long baited and fretted by distant darts, had turned at last, and finding his pursuers within his reach, would have been content with nothing less than their total destruction. That the Battle of Corunna, under the peculiar circumstances which attended it, was one of the most glorious which has been fought in modern times, will not be denied. It was that which furnished the most unequivocal proof of British firmness. The army could not have occupied a worse position, as Sir John Moore declared, but it could not be remedied. Our troops were not sufficiently numerous to occupy a more advanced post, which was therefore left for the enemy. The British soldiers had been harassed by a long and fatiguing retreat in the severest season of the year, and during peculiarly inclement weather. Their route had been through mountains covered with snow. They had been irregularly fed and the clothing partly worn off their backs. The enemy were far superior both in position and numbers, and the English army fought without either cavalry or artillery. But however glorious was the result of the battle to England, yet it was cause of national rejoicing to the enemy, although conquered. For Sir John Moore no longer guided a British force to rouse the jealousy and mar the plans of 250,000 French veterans accustomed to victory. He lay down on the land for whose freedom he bled, and slept on Iberia's breast forever. Sir John Moore's first appearance produced sentiments in the beholder not remote from reverence. His tall, manly and perfect form attracted general admiration, while his brilliant and penetrating eye denoted profound observation and proclaimed the determined soldier and able general. His words, voice and bearing realized all you had ever imagined of a perfect and highly polished gentleman endowed with every talent necessary to form the statesman or warrior. His features were formed to command the attention of man and make the deepest impression on the female heart. His memory, as I have been told by old officers who knew him well, was extraordinary, yet amiably defective. And what was once said of a great warrior might be justly applied to him, that he recollected everything save the injuries done to himself. Few have ever been gifted with more personal or mental charms than Sir John Moore, yet the perfection with which he was sent forth was far outshone by the glory that attended his progress and recall. Having but slightly touched on the circumstances attending the fall of this great man, I will repeat that after entirely approving the movement of the 4th Regiment in retiring their right wing and feeling satisfied as to what would take place in the valley, Sir John Moore made straight for the village of Elvina, where the fight continued to be most bloody and most obstinately maintained. It had been repeatedly taken and retaken at the point of the bayonet. Just as the commander of the forces arrived, the 50th Regiment, who were formed on the left of the village, commanded by Major Napier and seconded by Major Stanhope, made a most desperate charge through the village. But Napier's impetuosity, carrying him forward through some stone walls beyond the village, he was desperately wounded and fell into the hands of the enemy, and Major Stanhope was killed. The general cheered the regiment during this charge, crying out, "Bravo, 50th, and my 2 brave majors!" Then, perceiving the enemy coming forward to renew the struggle, he ordered up a battalion of the Guards, directing at the same time that the 2 regiments already engaged should be supplied anew with ammunition. The 50th continued firm, but the 42nd, mistaking this as an order to go to the rear for ammunition, began to retire. Seeing this, the general rode up to the regiment, exclaiming, "My brave 42nd, if you have gallantly fired away all your ammunition, you have still your bayonets, more efficient. Recollect Egypt, think on Scotland. Come on, my gallant countrymen." Thus, directing the willing 42nd to meet the renewed attack on Elvina, he had the satisfaction to hear that the Guards were coming up, and, pleased with the progress of the 42nd, he proudly sat erect on his war steed, calmly casting a satisfied glance at the raging war around. It was at this moment that he was struck to the ground by a cannon-ball, which laid open the breast of as upright and gallant a soldier as ever freely surrendered life in maintaining the honour and glory of his king and country. He soon arose to a sitting position, his eyes kindling with their usual brilliancy, when informed that the enemy were victoriously repulsed at all points. At this period the battle raged in its utmost fury, and an active general movement was taking place from right to left of both lines, the enemy retiring, the British pressing forward. And now Sir David Baird also was knocked down, receiving the wound for which he subsequently suffered the amputation of his arm. On placing Sir John Moore in the blanket in which he was borne to the rear, the hilt of his sword got into the wound, and as they tried to take it away, he declined having it moved, saying, "It may as well remain where it is, for, like the Spartan with his shield, the Briton should be taken out of the field with his sword." The wound was of the most dreadful nature. The shoulder was shattered, the arm scarcely attached to the body, the ribs over his heart smashed and laid bare. Thus was Sir John Moore carried to the rear. As he proceeded, perceiving from the direction of the firing that our troops were advancing, he exclaimed, "I hope the people of England will be satisfied." On being taken to his house in Corunna, he again inquired about the battle, and being assured that the enemy were beaten at all points, exclaimed, "It is great satisfaction to me to know that the French are beaten. I hope my country will do me justice." Whether this well-founded hope was realized or not, let the just and generous determine. He now inquired about the safety of several officers, those of his staff in particular, and he recommended several for promotion whom he considered deserving. This exertion caused a failing in his strength, but on regaining it in a slight degree, addressing his old friend Colonel Anderson, he asked if Paget was in the room. Upon being answered in the negative, he desired to be remembered to him, saying, "He is a fine fellow. 'Tis General Paget, I mean." This was a noble testimonial to that gallant officer's high character, rendered sacred by the peculiar circumstances in which it was called forth, and it strongly marked the martial spirit and high mind of the dying hero, who, with his body writhing in torture, the veil of eternity fast clouding his vision and his lips quivering in the convulsive spasms of death, sighed forth his last words in admiration of the brave. The Battle of Corunna terminated at the same moment that the British commander expired. He was buried in the citadel. As the enemy's last guns were firing, his remains were lowered into the grave by his staff, simply wrapped in his military cloak. No external mark of mourning was displayed. The grief could not be withdrawn from the heart. Thus, like a staunch general of the empire, Sir John Moore terminated his splendid career in maintaining its honour and crushing its foes. Yet his last act was peculiarly devoted to his own Scotland. It was cheering on the Royal Highlanders to a victorious charge. How Scotland has shown her recognition of the gallant and patriotic deed, or her admiration of the splendid career of the brightest ornament whom she ever sent forth on the glorious theatre of war, I have never been told. On January 18th, 1809, the British army sailed from Corunna, and having encountered very boisterous weather, the fleet were dispersed, and the regiments arrived in England at different ports and at different periods during the latter end of the month and the beginning of February. One wing of the 28th Regiment landed at Portsmouth. The other, to which I belonged, disembarked at Plymouth. Our appearance on landing was very unseemly, owing principally to the hurry attending our embarkation at Corunna, which took place in the dark and in the presence of an enemy. Scarcely a regiment got on board the vessel which contained their baggage, and the consequence was that on quitting our ships we presented an appearance of much dirt and misery. The men were ragged, displaying torn garments of all colours, and the people of England, accustomed to witness the high order and unparalleled cleanliness of their national troops, for which they are renowned throughout Europe, and never having seen an army after the termination of a hard campaign, were horror-struck, and persuaded themselves that some dreadful calamity must have occurred. Their consternation was artfully wrought up to the highest pitch by the wily old soldiers, who, fully aware of the advantage to be gained by this state of general excitement, and further to work on the feelings, recited in pathetic strain the most frightful accounts of their sufferings and hardships. Interested persons at home profited by this state of universal ferment. One political party, eagerly catching at any circumstances which could tend to incriminate the other, highly exaggerated even those already incredible accounts, while the other side, who felt that all the disasters attending the campaign properly rested with themselves, joined in the cry and with mean political subterfuge endeavoured to throw the onus off their own shoulders onto the breast of the silent, the unconscious dead. A general outcry was got up against Sir John Moore. He was accused of being stupid, of being irresolute, of running away, and of God knows what. His memory was assailed alike by those politically opposed to his party and by those who once were his supporters, and who, although aware of his masculine genius, maintained their posts by basely resorting to calumny and deceit. During this campaign, it was the opinion of many that circumstances occurred which, under more favourable auspices, would have induced some individuals to expect promotion. But the jarring and disturbed state of the cabinet, each individual endeavouring to counteract the measures of his colleague, threw out a foggy gloom damping all hopes, and when the eminent services of Sir John Moore and those of General Paget were passed over unnoticed, it would have been a military heresy to have accepted, much more to solicit promotion. After remaining a few days at Plymouth, we proceeded as far as Exeter, and there halted for the space of a week to await further instructions from London. During our stay at this place, we lived at the Old London Inn, and here a curious scene took place. Two Spanish gentlemen stopped at the inn on their way to Falmouth, and when after dinner their bill was presented, a misunderstanding took place. I should premise that at this, as at many other inns in England, every edible article produced on the table is charged separately. The Spaniards, after carefully examining the bill, objected to pay it. The waiter reported to his master, who interfered, but since he was as ignorant of Spanish as his guests were of the English language, all was confusion. The arguments and assertions of either party were totally incomprehensible to the other. After fruitless clamour, the landlord came into the room where we, the officers of the regiment, dined, requesting to know if any of us could assist him in his dilemma. Although not very well acquainted with the Spanish language at that time, I volunteered my services. The Spaniards were very wrathful and boldly asserted that the innkeeper attempted to extort payment for a dish which was never brought to them. This they were firm in maintaining, having counted every article. One swore that he never touched anything of the kind, and that, if brought into the room, it must have been covered on the sideboard. The other accused the cook of having used it himself in the kitchen, and of trying, that he might conceal his gormandizing, to make them pay, declaring at the same time that the affair should be laid open to the public for the benefit of future travellers who might otherwise be taken in. By their accounts, it was impossible that I could fathom the affair, and as soon as the Spaniards allowed me to speak, I called the waiter to bring his written bill, and on this one of the gentlemen pointed out what he considered to be the cheat. I took the paper from the waiter when, lo, upon examination I discovered the viand in dispute to be the chambermaid, who was charged in the bill at 2 shillings. I could not restrain a loud fit of laughter, which roused the blood of the Castilians even more than the cheat. But when I explained the cause, they were as ready to enter into the joke as any others. Upon asking mine host how he could think of making a charge for the chambermaid in his bill, thus making a voluntary donation obligatory, he replied that had he not done so, foreigners would never pay her, that his servants had no other wages than those which they got from customers. The Spaniards paid the bill most willingly and joined our table, and the whole party laughed heartily during the remainder of the evening. The order for continuing our route having at length arrived, we proceeded to occupy our old quarters, Colchester, where, after passing through Dorset, to avoid falling in with other troops on the move, we arrived after a march which, including partial halts, occupied 1 month and 5 days, giving an addendum to our campaign of from between 300 and 400 miles, without leaving a single straggler behind. This march bore heavily by lightening us of all our cash, and dipped us besides in the paymaster's books. In less than 3 months after the regiment was united at Colchester, we again were ordered upon what we joyfully contemplated as active service. A magnificent expedition was sent out to carry off, if allowed, the Gallia Dutch fleet from the Schelde. The land forces, commanded by the Earl of Chatham, were composed of 40,000 men, the flower of the British Army. This force was accompanied by a not less imposing naval force, 39 sail of the line, 3 dozen frigates and innumerable satellites, bomb-ships, gunboats, brigs, etc., which, together with store-ships, transports and other craft, amounted in the whole to upwards of 600 sail. To join this splendid armament, the 28th Regiment marched from Colchester in the latter end of June, and reached Dover on July 4th. Thence we, in a few days, proceeded to Deal, where we embarked on board frigates, a squadron of that class of men of war under command of Sir Richard Keats being destined to carry the reserve of the army. This arrangement was adopted in consequence of the frigates drawing less water than ships of the line, thus enabling them to lie closer inshore and quicken the disembarkation of the reserve, who of course were the first troops to land. We remained upwards of a week anchored at Deal, awaiting final instructions, and the junction of the whole. During this delay, some 1,000 families, many of the highest lineage in the kingdom, visited Deal. All arrangements being finally terminated, this truly magnificent naval and military armament sailed on July 28, 1809. Thousands of superbly dressed women crowded the beach. Splendid equipages were numerous. All the musical bands in the fleet, as well military as naval, joined in one general concert, playing the national anthem which, with the loud and long-continued cheering on shore, enlivened the neighbourhood for miles around and caused the most enthusiastic excitement throughout the whole. Many beauteous fair, whose smiles were rendered yet more brilliant by the intrusive tear, waved their handkerchiefs in the breeze to the fond objects of their fixed regard, who responded with silent but steadfast gaze, burning with the two noblest passions which inspire the breast of man, love and glory. The show was august, the pageant splendid, the music enchanting. Next morning we discovered the dike-bound fens of Holland, little anticipating that they were shortly to become British graveyards. About noon we anchored, and the remainder of the day was passed in preparing the 3 days' cooked provisions, always carried by British soldiers on landing in an enemy's country. The next day proved boisterous, and to our great mortification, nothing general could be attempted. However, about noon, the weather having somewhat abated, great commotion was observed throughout the armament. Signals from ship to ship throughout the fleet portended great events. Sir Richard Keats lowered his flag, followed by Sir John Hope on board the Salsette frigate, which carried the left wing of the 28th Regiment, with the exception of the Light Company. The Light Company embarked with the headquarters on board the Lavinia frigate, commanded by Lord William Stewart. After due consultation between the Admiral and General, a signal was made calling for all the carpenters of the squadron with their tools. Some momentous affair was evidently at hand. 4 companies of the 28th Regiment were lowered into boats, which, being joined by the Light Company from on board the Lavinia, were placed under the command of Major Brown of the regiment. We now immediately pushed off, animated by the cheers of the whole fleet. The shore was soon reached, the Light Company leading the van, the first on hostile ground. Advancing some way, we encountered a piquet, who, on our shooting the Fever, the egg only remained, out of a few trembling Dutchmen, thought proper to retire. Upon this we proceeded to carry into execution the object of the expedition, which, I forgot to mention before, was to destroy a signal post. The carpenters now came in for a full share of the glory. Each axe that fell upon the staff was answered by cheers loud as salvos. But when the mast, after repeated blows, was seen to fall, so loud were the greetings that some ships passing at a distance, on their way to England, and reporting what they had heard, induced many there to think that Antwerp had fallen into our hands. After the fall and destruction of the telegraph, we returned triumphantly on board, carrying away all the machinery books and signals, and thus alone, the 28th Regiment signalized itself during this stupendous campaign. Next morning, July 31st, a signal was made for all the troops to descend into the boats and prepare for landing. The rapidity of the current was such that the boats were carried away by the stream and clung alongside of any vessel that came in their way. I recollect that Lieutenant Colonel Woodford, with his Light Company of the Coldstream Guards, held on by the Lavinia and was taken on board. The officers dined with Lord William Stewart, who, having been called away by Sir Richard Keats, requested me to do the honours of his table during his absence, and his guests, to relieve me from any embarrassment, freely and cheerfully partook of his lordship's fare. I more than once in later days met Colonel Woodford in London, and remember not only his polished address and courteous manner, but also his prompt recognition and ready kindness. August 1st being fine, the reserve under Sir John Hope landed on the island of South Beveland, while the other troops went ashore principally on the island of Walcheren, and soon proceeded to besiege Flushing. On the 13th, the bombardment of that fortress commenced. It was only on the morning of the 14th that, after many previous consultations, a squadron of frigates commanded by Lord William Stewart forced the passage of the Schelde, and, notwithstanding the delay caused by considering the enterprise too dangerous to be attempted, only one vessel, the Lavinia which led, was struck by only one shot. On the morning of the 15th, Flushing capitulated. In the meantime, The reserve in South Beveland stormed and took Fort Batts, a strong post occupied by the enemy. On the 11th, an attempt was made by the enemy's gunboats to retake it, but the Guards, who originally took the fort, now successfully defended it. Flushing having fallen, our frigates in the Schelde, and all the channels and passages round the islands scoured by our gunboats, the reserve expected hourly to be ordered to attack Antwerp and the enemy's fleet, who lay in our view and within our grasp, not far from Antwerp. However, we were grievously disappointed. With the fall of Flushing fell all our warlike operations. After we had remained inactive a sufficient time to allow Fouché to collect and throw 30,000 men into Antwerp and its defences, and to erect batteries along all the approaches which he armed with the guns taken from their now useless ships, the commander of the forces, with the courtesy of manner which distinguished that nobleman, very politely requested the French to give up their fleet. But that surly son of a tub-maker, Bernadotte, sent a flat refusal, and finding too late that late court hours and measured movements were ineffectual against rapid and early-rising revolutionists, Lord Chatham, with the greater part of the survivors of his fevered army, returned to England on September 14th. A portion were left behind to favour the introduction of prohibited goods, but the fatality and expense attending the maintenance of this contraband establishment being found to more than counterbalance the advantages proposed, the project was abandoned, and those who escaped pestilence returned on December 23rd. The splendid pageantry that attended, and the national joyous pride that greeted the departure of this superb armament, were woefully contrasted with its return. The unwieldy expedition, although it furnished cause of merriment all over the continent, deluged the British Empire with tears. There was scarcely a family in Great Britain which did not mourn the fate of a gallant soldier, without one cheering ray to brighten the gloom, one laurel leaf to be hallowed by their affectionate tears. The mortality among the troops was so great that bands of music were forbidden to attend the military funerals. After having filled up some 100 vacancies caused by our Dutch expedition, we again received orders to prepare for foreign service, and in January 1810, the 28th Regiment, for the 4th time in 4 successive years, marched from Colchester to go out and meet the foe in foreign lands. On this occasion, we proceeded to Portsmouth, and with the 2nd Battalion of the 4th or King's Own Regiment, embarked for Gibraltar, where we arrived towards the latter end of the ensuing month. In the April following, Major Brown of the regiment, with the light companies of the 9th, 30th and 41st Regiments, a battalion company of the 28th which I accompanied, 2 guns and 30 gunners, the whole amounting to 360 men and officers, marched to Tarifa, a small town at the entrance of the Gut of Gibraltar, afterwards rendered celebrated by its noble defence under Colonel Skerritt against Marshal Victor. Soon after our arrival, I was sent by Major Brown with dispatches to General Campbell, then Lieutenant Governor of Gibraltar. Returning next day with the General's instructions, when I had got about halfway, my attention was suddenly called by the peasantry, who pastured their flocks on the neighbouring hills, frequently crying out, "Beware of the French!" Neither the dragoon who accompanied me nor I myself could discover the slightest appearance of an enemy, and I knew that the French occupied no part within 20 miles of the place. Under this conviction, I proceeded forwards, yet cautiously, for the shepherds, who seemed much excited, were running in all directions collecting their flocks. On our advancing a short way, we heard the shouts, "Beware of the French!" repeated with redoubled vehemence. I now stopped short, when suddenly a French cavalry piquet, consisting of about 20 men and an officer, darted from out the thickets, which were so high, and the patrol so well concealed that, although within 150 yards of us, neither the dragoon nor I had discovered any appearance of either man or horse. They were in their saddles in an instant, and saluted us with their carbines and pistols literally before we had time to turn our horses round. My dragoon darted like lightning off the road towards the coast, calling upon me to follow, and in an instant was lost to sight. I felt much disinclination to trust my safety to concealment in a country with 1 yard of which off the road I was not acquainted. I therefore resolved to rely on the abilities of my horse to make good my retreat along the road. I could depend upon him for speed. The patrol gave me chase for upwards of 4 miles. We always preserved nearly the same distance, from 100 to 150 yards apart, losing sight of each other only when a turn in the road or some high brambles intervened. Our uniformly preserving nearly the same distance did not depend on the equal speed of our animals, but on the nature of the road, which was perhaps the worst mountain road in Europe, and so deep and so little apart were the ruts by which it was completely traversed that to push a spirited horse would be to break his neck to a certainty, and most probably that of the rider also. On approaching the Cork Wood, not far from Algeciras, the ground being comparatively level, I very soon left the dragoons far behind. On my arrival at Algeciras, learning that 2 Spanish regiments of cavalry had just arrived there, I immediately waited on the senior officer and informed him of what had occurred, using every remonstrance which I could suggest to induce him to march to the aid of Tarifa, which, even before I entered the town, he knew from the peasantry to be attacked. But all my prayers that he would aid Tarifa, or at least cut off the retreat of the enemy, were ineffectual. The Spanish commandant alleging that without orders he could not move. Upon this I wrote to Lieutenant Belcher, Assistant Military Secretary to General Campbell, stating all that had taken place, at the same time remarking that from the fact, which I learned also from the peasantry, who from far and near drove their flocks into Algeciras, that no sortie had been made by Major Brown. I felt convinced that he was attacked by a force much superior to his own. This letter I immediately sent off by a boat to Gibraltar. As soon as it became dusk, I again mounted my horse, if possible, to get to Tarifa, attended by the same dragoon who accompanied me in the morning. This man, who was no coward, found his way into Algeciras about the same time that I arrived there. He assured me that he could conduct me by a coast road to within 100 yards of Tarifa without being discovered by any, as it was a road, or rather goat track, but little known. As a proof of the confidence which he felt, he insisted on taking the lead, for 2 horses could not move abreast, and like a true Spaniard drew his sabre even before he left the town. The only thing I obtained from the Spanish commandant was his gratuitous adieu, strongly recommending that I should not attempt to return to Tarifa until it should be thoroughly ascertained that the enemy had retired, to which advice, to avoid the enemy, I paid as much attention as he did to my recommendation to seek the enemy. I felt much anxiety to be at Tarifa, the more as I wished to tell Brown of what I had done, and that consequently he might expect a reinforcement. We arrived before daybreak near the town, where, meeting a friar, we heard that we might advance with safety, for the French had retired. It appears that as soon as Marshal Victor, whose corps were lying before Cadiz, had learned that Tarifa was occupied by English troops, he sent out a strong patrol of infantry and cavalry to ascertain our strength. He felt very jealous of the post, as it threatened his foraging parties, who frequently came to the neighbouring fertile plains to procure nourishment for his army, and principally to collect forage for his cavalry. For this reason it was that he sent the party mentioned, who appeared before the walls of Tarifa on the morning of April 20th, before daybreak, 7 days after the place had been in our possession. The surmise stated in my letter to Lieutenant Belcher proved true. Major Brown, in consequence of the strong force brought against him, did not move out of the garrison until the evening, when the enemy drew off a part of their troops. Then, as they still occupied a large convent and some uninhabited houses close to the town, a sortie was made, headed by Captain Stovin, when they were soon dislodged and pursued for a considerable distance. This demonstration against Tarifa was attended with but few results or casualties. One man only, a gunner, being killed and a few more wounded. Lieutenant Mitchell, a gallant officer, commanded the artillery. On my arrival at Tarifa, I acquainted Major Brown with all that had occurred to me during my absence, my useless endeavours to induce the Spanish regiments or any part of the garrison of Algeciras to intercept the enemy's return from Tarifa, and finally with my having written to Gibraltar. The Major fully approved of all the steps I had taken, and my letter being laid before General Campbell, he ordered 4 companies of the 47th Regiment, under the command of Captain O'Donoghue of that corps, instantly to embark for Tarifa, but the wind becoming contrary, they were obliged to disembark at Algeciras and proceed overland. They arrived at Tarifa the night after my return there, and here they continued until the month of September. Then the 28th Regiment, whose Colonel Belson had gone to England in consequence of ill health, were ordered to Tarifa, and Captain O'Donoghue's detachment, together with the light companies which originally had accompanied Major Brown, were then recalled to Gibraltar. Shortly after this attack on Tarifa, an English merchant vessel was captured by a French privateer in the neighbourhood of Veja, not far from Tarifa. A midshipman who commanded a gunboat detached from the guardship at Gibraltar reported the circumstance to Major Brown and applied to him for a detachment of soldiers to embark on board his boat, stating that so strengthened he might retake the vessel. Brown, in whose estimation the honour of His Majesty's arms in whatever branch of the service was paramount to any other sentiment, hesitated not a moment and ordered me, with as many men of the light company, 28th, as the gunboat could stow, to embark immediately. Leaving Tarifa in the evening and pulling all night, we found ourselves next morning at dawn in the celebrated Bay of Trafalgar, and as soon as light enabled us to see, we discovered the vessel alluded to about 2 miles distant. We immediately swept towards her. Soon after a boat put off from the shore, now in possession of the French, with intention, as we afterwards discovered, to set the ship on fire, while some of the sailors and soldiers in turn used every exertion to row, or rather sweep. We kept up as quick a fire as possible with a long 12-pounder and a 24-pounder at the boat coming from shore. One shot having struck not far beyond her, whilst a shower of grape fell but little short, she thought proper to retire. Being thus freed from the enemy's boat, we made a wide offing to keep the vessel between us and shore, within musket shot of which she was run aground. On boarding her, we placed bales of wool or cotton, which formed the principal part of her cargo, along her side next the shore to cover us from the fire of musketry. For by this time, a strong detachment of French infantry came down close to the water's edge, ranging themselves in loose order, so as not to offer any dense body to the fire of the gunboat, which, after putting the soldiers on board the merchantman, retired beyond musket range of the shore and kept up a fire of round shot and grape. The enemy on shore had a similar covering to our own, having the night before disembarked several bales of the cotton. Whenever any of these was struck by a round shot, its bounding from the beach presented a most fantastic appearance, and caused shouts of laughter among the men, which tended to lighten their fatigue. After working indefatigably for several hours, we at length succeeded in getting the vessel afloat. Our labour was much heightened by our being obliged to work her off by the windlass, since her capstan was unshipped and carried away by the French, who had everything in preparation on board to set fire to her as soon as unloaded, or if there were an attempt at rescue. Having succeeded in carrying her off, we returned next day to Tarifa, where we landed in triumph from our prize, as she was termed. Next day she was sent to Gibraltar, and condemned, I think, to salvage or some such term. But never having on entering the army contemplated becoming a prize fighter, I may be mistaken as to terms. On a distribution of this said salvage money being made, I was put down to receive a portion such as is allotted to a sailor, probably an able-bodied one, but on some person in Gibraltar, suggesting that probably, it would not be correct to class me, who was the only commissioned officer present at the recapture or within sight of it. With a common sailor, I was on reflection, ranked with the petty officers, cooks, etc., thereby gaining promotion from the forecastle to the caboose and obtaining the rank if not the title of cook. I employed no agent, considering my claims safe in the hands of the sister profession. Captain Vivian, who commanded the guardship the San Juan at Gibraltar, I was told, superintended the arrangement and, together with the whole of his officers and crew, shared in the spoil, each officer having a much larger portion than that dealt out to me, although neither he nor they aided or assisted, or were or could be in sight when the capture took place. The midshipman who commanded the gunboat was equally unfortunate as to the share to which he was entitled as the only acting naval officer present at the capture, but I heard at the time that to quiet him he was otherwise rewarded. If true, I feel happy at it, and we both should feel content, he at being promoted to the rank of a commissioned officer, and I at receiving a diploma as a master of gastronomic science, although to this day I am ignorant how to compose even a basin of pea soup. Shortly afterwards, I met Mr. William Sweetland, who was employed as agent on the occasion. On questioning him as to the extraordinary distribution, he, with professional coolness, replied that he was employed on the other side, that no person appeared on my behalf, and that if anybody had, of course there could be no question as to the sentence which must have been passed. I was strongly advised to appeal to the Admiralty, as I might thereby gain a sum of money that would tend to my advancement, but I foolishly disregarded the counsel. So I took my cook's wages, and therewith drank to the health of my sovereign, the honour and glory of my old profession, and success forever to the Royal Navy. I was afterwards informed that thanks were given to me in public orders by Sir Richard Keats. I never saw the order, and therefore cannot answer for its existence, yet the fact could easily be ascertained by any feeling interest in the subject. For my own part, I felt so dissatisfied at the mercenary or jobbing part of the transaction that I never took any step to ascertain whether the thanks were or were not published. Colonel Brown, having visited Gibraltar shortly after the transaction had taken place, fully explained his and my sentiments to Captain Vivian on the quarter-deck of the San Juan, among other assertions upholding that he himself and the whole garrison of Tarifa, from which Lieutenant Blakeney was detached, had as strong a claim to participation in the salvage as Captain Vivian and the crew of the guardship. And here he was perfectly right, for the garrison of Tarifa was 25 miles nearer to the scene of action than the San Juan stationed at Gibraltar.